Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor to see you all there with us. And as you know, we are supposed to honor today Salvatore Martirano. And probably I need to tell a bit of prehistory of how the concept of the event came into being. So first, introducing myself, my name is Anastasia, and I'm a doctoral student in the history department and studying the history of art, science, and technology. And apparently it was my idea to initiate the series of 11 events that bring all three together. And I found a partner in crime who will spearhead the whole event series, and it's a special honor to be the second person after Salvatore Martirano who brought David here as a J. Miller professor, which first time happened in 1995, and that residency was initiated in spite of Sal going through the illness. Ultimately, it's not worthy that my own shift to research in experimental music that began a bit more than a year ago. It started with on my birthday while still in Russia before coming here. And I was zooming in with my advisor, and he prompted me to check the finding aid for the archival collection of Sal and proposed to go together and to the Susa archive when I will arrive here and to see Salmar. And we did that, and that's basically how my conversion started and how we've got there. And in the long run, even more fateful was my meeting with his student, and here we are. Today, along with David Rosenboom, we will have with us Ben Grosser, professor at the School of Art and Design and at iSchool. Ben is a friend of family, and he represents another generation of Sal's students. And he will join David for a discussion of Sal's legacy. We will also have the excerpt of poetry reading by Michael Holloway, who passed away just a while ago, but it was originally supposed he will be today with us. So it's a special moment that to give a tribute to him today as well. And we will also have with us, almost remotely, Greg Dunner, who helped Sal with construction of this marvelous instrument, and Ken Beck, who will be performing Salmar and engaging with David from Susa archives, where they will be looked after by Scott Schwarz, the director of Susa Archives for American Music and the principal organizer of this event. And exhibition, the excellent exhibition you could see at the entry here. And finally, I should express the immense gratitude to the family of Sal, to Dorothy, and to John Martirano, without whom the whole thing probably will not happen as well. And to Isa, the granddaughter whom we hope to see today, but I think you will share the impressions with her as well. So probably without further ado, I should give the floor to the J. Miller professor, the second time, David Rosenboom. Please join welcoming him.
Thank you, Anastasia. The person who gave me all the work of putting together 11 public events in 2 weeks, which I'm thrilled about, plus a radio show on Sunday. And so this is the second one, and it's been so far really gratifying and heartening to meet new people who are here that I had not met before, and some old friends from years ago when I was here. I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes, and then we're gonna watch a video. But So a little history. I came here in 1965, and I was at high school. I grew up actually near Quincy, which is 200 miles to the west on the Mississippi River, and I had gone to. I had the good fortune in high school to have also gone to Interlochen as a composition major, and from there I was directed to apply to Eastman because Interlochen is an Eastman feeder school, and but I was interested in some of the abstract things that were coming about, and I had read Milton Babbitt's work, and so I applied to Princeton. And then a high school friend named Will Parsons, who was a great percussionist, we went to the same high school, was also from Quincy, told me when I came over here in the Illinois Summer Youth Music Program that I got to meet this guy, Sal Martirano, who was working on a piece called Underworld. And that was it. When I had that experience, I said, no, this is where I'm going. So I came here and was assigned to work with Gordon Bingert for my first semester, which is great. He taught me a lot, but I was just wanting to work with Sal, and people were saying, oh, you should do this first and so on, and work with Sal when you get a little older, and I said, nope. So by the time my second semester, I started working with Sal, and we became eventually colleagues and good friends through the rest of his life, and had many, many wonderful interactions. So I have had a lot of experience working with him, and it all incredibly positive. So I'll talk more about that when I give my official sort of talk here, and get into some of the get into the weeds a bit about various pieces and about the Salmar construction, about which I recently published a book chapter, and I'll tell you about that later. But that's the instrument, and this panel right here with all the lights on it, there are 291 touch buttons there, and when it was originally constructed, not a single one was labeled. So Sal knew what every one of them did. I learned about that, but I never was the virtuoso that Sal was in playing it, though I have played it. And when it was renovated some years ago, I came back quite a while ago for a conference on ethnomusicology and improvisation that was put together by Bruno Nettel and his colleagues. And Greg Danner was a hero in getting all the circuitry to work again, and I did a performance then, but I haven't touched it since. And now the buttons are labeled. So, but they weren't before that. So Greg and Ken are going to give a demonstration. But the first thing is we're going to watch an introductory video that John Martirano has put together about Sal. So I'm going to play that.
You ought to be. Fall, my dear, to be true for I am a fool for beauty.
I remember first encountering that name and having no idea, Salvatore Martirano, what could that be like?
By the feeling that because I have found.
Well, you know, he was so many things. He was a very complex personality because he was very jovial, very affectionate, in every sense of the word. Very loyal, very concerned about his friends.
And the first thing I remember about him was the extraordinary gentleness and sensitivity. He was amazingly alive to what people were and what they needed.
At the same time, very tough. I mean, tough in every sense of the word, physically and intellectually. And also temper. He had a temper.
Beck. Pa 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 beep 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 po 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 ha 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 po po.
He's a very hungry, thirsty man, and very physical and very emotional and very subtle and sensitive, all those things kind of tied up in a bundle.
And when he didn't like somebody, the gloves were off. When he felt somebody was a fake of any kind. Or
I think that your dad was, in every way, a really big person. He had big appetites, he had big ideas, he had an enormous capacity for invention and for living. And I think everybody that had much contact with him must have known and must have felt that. And maybe that's one of the reasons that people could, or at least a lot of people, were able to endure aspects that were less attractive and forgive him, because it was as though he just had to live in a larger way. The sensitivity would turn your head, you know. I don't mean in a manipulative or false way. It was all true. The energy was true, the sensitivity was true, the violence was true, the tenderness was true.
We were sort of cut out of the same cloth emotionally. I mean, he was a very passionate fellow and loved life and everything that life had to offer, and very focused. When I started to look at his music, I found the same qualities there. And I do remember an a cappella mass that he showed me that I was very, very impressed by. I thought it was very powerful.
you know, the music that many of us admired right away was the Mass.
It was your father's penance, he told me. It was, in a sense, something for the older folks. A tie that was maintained rather than abandoned.
The lessons that I learned from Sal that really mattered, that are with me to this day, are what I call the big lessons about music. The importance of surprise, the value of unpredictability. Whenever I would start playing something that Sal thought was too, predictable, overly meticulous, you know, basically almost too clear, you know, he would come over and he would just shove me off the bench. And he would sit down and he would start just playing, you know, just like playing all kinds of just outside shit, man. And I was thinking, wow, you know, that's something that is, it was a place my mind wanted to go anyway. The left turn, doing the unexpected. You're like in the middle of one idea and you transform it into something that didn't sound like it was what was going to come right after that.
And I'll never forget the times that I heard the Salmar construction.
No one could build something as quirky as a Salmar construction without a strong commitment to personal identity.
Certainly I was just bowled over by the idea of him basically starting from zero and acquiring the knowledge necessary, if not to design and build the whole thing, to be a singularly important guiding spirit in what was happening.
I saw it as a kind of embodiment in circuitry of Sal's compositional thinking, you know, a certain aspect of his compositional thinking.
I walk into this room, there's like 28 speakers, these round things hanging from the ceiling, and there's this huge device in the corner, this enormous thing, and I was thinking, what is this, man? Who's going to play this? And then this guy comes up, and I get introduced to him, and this is Sal Martirano, and he's like, you know, I'm thinking, boy, and he starts talking, and I realized right away, this is not my image of what contemporary composers are supposed to be like. I guess at that time, he was calling these concerts something like, look at the back of my head for a while. The thing would be set up, and he'll be facing it, and it looked like a demented version of the mighty Wurlitzer, you know, and he'll be sitting there punching switches and doing things, all this sound will be coming in.
I remember having dinners at your home where the Salmar would be playing during dinner. And every once in a while, everybody would just be quiet because it would be in an interesting place. You know, it would have evolved into something that it just quieted everybody. And then after a while, people would start talking again, but it would be there, almost as a personality.
One of the things that I always felt was key to working with him and his use of all this stuff was that he was a great musician, you know. There was always a musicality in everything.
I saw him sit down once and play four hands on a bench with Mel Powell, one of the greatest jazz pianists who ever lived. And they had a marvelous time together. I've never seen him happier. They would kind of outdo each other.
It struck me always that he selected every note. You know, that there's not time to do that, but he did.
He's somebody that I've known a lot of very remarkable people in my life, especially musicians, major figures of the second half of the 20th century. And one of the things that you notice about people like that, Takemitsu, Xenakis, Feldman, Cage, these kinds of people, Boulez, is that they are, in a certain way, there's an energy and a creativity and a vitality and that is part of what they can do and part of why they are what they are. And he was like that. So I mean, one had the feeling that any time you were around him, really interesting and engaging things that could change you were going to happen. And they did.
Well, I can add to anything to what we've already done, let me know. I have a lot of questions to ask. If anybody wants to answer.
Thank you, John, for putting that together. It's very nice. Now, the machine itself, of course, is sitting over in the Sousa Archives of American Music. They are across the campus a ways. And we're going to move to a segment where Greg Danner and Ken Beck are going to demonstrate the instrument. So they're going to play it a little bit, and it's being streamed over here live. So they're over there doing it because it's not so easy to move that. It was never easy to move that thing. Sal used to drive around the country with a big U-Haul, carrying it around. It did make it to France once and made it back to IRCAM, to Paris, but it was not easy to move. And now, in its delicate, renovated state, it stays there. So now we have the time for Greg and Ken to give us a demonstration of the machine itself. Thank you, Ken and Greg. I don't know if it's possible for you to demonstrate a couple of things. I sent a couple of ideas. One of the things that the machine uses extensively is the concept of what is called a pseudo-random sequence generator. A pseudo-random sequence is a sequence that appears to be somewhat unpredictable, but is actually not, because as computer science shows, it's not possible for a discrete state machine, and this is a discrete state digital machine, to produce true randomness. It's not possible. You can do it, you can write a program to do it, and you can create a sequence that is zillions of numbers long and appears to be random, but if you let it go long enough, it will eventually repeat. And so for musical purposes, however, that actually is really interesting, and I'm going to talk about how we worked with combinatorics a little bit later, compositionally. But you can, the circuitry that creates them in an instrument like this is known as a feedback shift register. Shift register shifts bits along a sequence, and then you can read them out and feed them back through some logic circuitry back to the input. And that'll produce pseudo-random sequences that can be sometimes very short, and you hear a pattern repeating, and a little bit longer, and a little bit longer, and a little bit longer. And by controlling that length to some extent, you can work with the concept of surprise and predictability, which was brought up by someone, I've forgotten who, in the video we just saw. So it actually is musically really interesting. And so I don't know if you guys can do it, but maybe comparing one that's rather short and then one that's longer. Is that possible? So you're hearing a fairly short one there, but you never quite know where it's going to go. Then as it gets longer, it becomes harder to follow a pattern. Thank you. Okay. Another thing, another principle or another part of the design that allowed for the range of timbres to get to modulate quite radically was that the sound generation included two waveform memories, which could be filled up with all sorts of data, and you crossfade from one to the other. So you can be listening to the results of one waveform table, and then filling the other table with all sorts of whatever you want, and then you crossfade over to it, and you have this whole new timbre, radical shift that's difficult to do with synthesizers of the time. And then, or you could hear a mix of them, and then you could shift back again. That was a brilliant way to create timbral variation in a rather dramatic way. I mean, I imagine in some of the latter part of what these guys demonstrated, when you were hearing the noisy sounds come in, that might have been done that way. I'm not sure what they were doing, but. There we go. Yeah. And you could make control structures that would cause that shift to go back and forth in pretty complex ways. Okay. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Great. Thank you. And while we can see it here, I'm using a pointer so the audience can see what I'm pointing at. I'm pointing to the 24-channel distribution system. Now, when the machine was first used, it had 24 outputs. It also had a mix down to 4 outputs. And that's what we're hearing here, I think, is a mix to 4 outputs. Sal hit on the idea of using something that at that time manufactured by Radio Shack called polyplanar speakers. They were speakers that were actually made out of styrofoam, and they were thin like this, like so you could hang them on a wall in your living space like they were a painting. And they actually played pretty good. They weren't too good in the bass range, but up above that they actually were pretty interesting, and they were pretty cheap. And so he had plastic housings made for them and would take them around, and when he would arrive at a performance venue somewhere, he'd go around and survey the architecture and decide where to hang 24 speakers around the space. And then he had a system of distributing sound, and he had we always talked about parameters in music, and parameters, as James Senney would say, are the things that articulate the form of a composition. And Sal talked about what he called sound traffic. Sound traffic was a parameter, which means how a sound moves around in space as in sound traffic. So the way in the center there, you can see a 6x6 array now there's a diagonal line of lights on. And there are 2 sets of shift registers that are 3 bits and 4 bits and 5 bits. One along here, one down here. So it's 3, 4, 5 on top, and it's 5, 4, 3 on the bottom. And that's significant. They add up to 12, right? 12 was a big number in those days. So we have 2 prime numbers, 3 and 5, and then a minimally composite number 4. And that those were part of the system that would send sounds, say sound would enter the system as a monophonic sound and then be distributed around the 24 channels. So that's what you're seeing there. Now we're only hearing a mix to 4 of them, but you can see the entry of bits into these shift registers are being you can see what he's doing there, and they will determine how the sound moves around the space. So sound traffic was his idea of this kind of musical parameter. There they would be moving pretty fast now, so they'd be moving around quite a bit. That was quite an amazing system, actually. Yeah. So we can see it conceptually, because I think the structure of it itself is interesting, even though we can't hear 24 channels. But I thought I wanted to point that out, and you can see them manipulating it now at different rates of speed. Great. Thank you. Okay. Great. Great, thank you guys. Terrific. Okay, now I'm going to wax on here for a little while and try to give you a bit of a context of some of these things. So there are various documents that exist that do document some of the Salmar's development. This is one called Progress Report 1. Sal gave me a copy of this way back when he first put it together. and he was reporting on the progress of developing Salmar. And he always had, even in a research project report, he always had a way of putting in some poetic humor that was really quite amazing. So here's his memogram poem from the progress report, which I thought was fun to see. Page of expletive, monolithic speakers, one shot, rams, roms, stop, X, ors, logic functions. All the way down to nans, odd, stop, shift, shotkeys, pop, 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 tune, so on, blah, blah, ADD, 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 all the sort of like lingo of electronic digital design. CC to LSA, large scale integration, medium scale integration, and small scale integration. So there was always something really fun in these documents that he created. For reference, there's a recent book from MIT Press called Between the Tracks, and I was asked to write a chapter about the Salmar, and I did the best I could to describe it in as much detail as MIT Press would allow me to include, but I wanted it to be really seen from a compositional point of view. So exploring compositional choice in the Salmar construction, because for me, and I think mostly it's recognized now, I always thought of it, as I said in the video, this was an embodiment of a composer's concept of composition, almost cognitive model of composition in hardware, as best that could be done at the time. And Sal was, his thinking about composition was very combinatoric, as I said before. We were always talking about combinations, permutations, collections, and we even studied a little bit of combinatorial logic, which you could say could have come out of serialism and 12-tone music, but it was broadened and generalized to be much more applicable to musical objects, musical parameters, than only just to pitches and durations and things like that. Anyway, that sort of mental model of composition got imbued as best it could in hardware, in actual circuitry. And that's one of the things that is really unique about this instrument. So that chapter tries to talk about it in much more greater detail than I can do tonight. But I want to go back a little bit historically and talk about leading up to this, because I think that in a lot of Sal's early music, you can see hints of this, like in this 1960 composition Contrasto. This is the first violin lines, and you get and then if you analyze that line and the pitches that are in that line, you find the way in which they modulate begins to sound like the way some of the permutations and combinations later happened. And then also the sort of sudden bursts of things that would happen in a Salmar performance, with Sal performing, you can see precursors of in some of the music. This is just a line from his cocktail music from piano from 1962. You'd have these sort of swirling things. It's not really pointillistic, because there's a line there, and the line is very, very beautiful in the way it's constructed. This is a page from the octet from 1963, which is really an orchestration of cocktail music. They're actually almost the same piece, because the octet was written for, while I think Sal was in Berkeley, California, on a Ford Foundation grant to as a resident of Berkeley High School, and before coming to Champaign-Urbana, and had a commission or something to make a piece very quickly, and he's made a sort of second version of cocktail music for an ensemble. But it has these sort of jumping around chords, which to me begin to presage some of the compositional style. This is an example of the way he thought in terms of serialism. He developed this idea of something called the magic square, where he has here a series of trichords, groups of 3 notes, which, and this is in his handwriting, so which have the original, all the original notes are going down like this, a transposition, an inversion, and another inversion. So what's the result of this? The result is that you can take any box and you get a new 12-tone row. You can take any set of 4, the outer 4 groups, and you get a new 12-tone row. You can take a diagonal and you get a new one, or a diagonal like that. And different sets of 4 that create this whole set of collections of 12-tone rows. So he thought that way. That system appears in several pieces. It appeared in Ballad, which you heard at the opening of John's film, with Don Smith singing and Ron DeWar playing saxophone. He used that system there, and he used it in Underworld and maybe some other places too. Now, Underworld was the piece that I first encountered, and it's one in which Sal used the computing resources of the university to create an electronic tape using the IBM 7094, and the CX1 was used to translate the output of the 7094 into audio. And he used it to create a complex rhythmic structure that was a series of we call it a rhythm gate tape. It had tones in various rhythms that he took that over to the experimental music studio and generated sound there with the resources there. I think probably the Jim Beauchamp's, the late Jim Beauchamp's sound harmonic tone generator, which was another innovative instrument from that time period to generate what would eventually be a tape that would be played as part of Underworld. But Underworld is full of all kinds of things that get put in various permutations, including various acting gestures, presaging a little bit the idea of his later LGA, and sounds of musicians making wailing sounds and laughing sounds, 5 kinds of laughing, 4 kinds of wailing, physical gestures, all used in sort of permutation and combination. Here's a little bit of way that sounded. This is just the beginning of a recording that's available out there. So we'd have to go further and take more time and listen to more of it to hear it, but it was really an amazing piece. Okay, so in, what was it, 68 and 9, somewhere in there. Oh, here we are, 1969. This is an article from the New York Times. And I was helping to produce a series of concerts at the Electric Circus in New York City. Called the Electric Ear, and we were bringing composers from around the country, especially people working in multimedia and things of that sort, to New York in this sort of radical multimedia palace that was called the Electric Circus. And Sal came to do and presented LGA there, and it was really quite an event. This is Sal, of course. This is Robert Ashley, who was there as part of this. This is the producer of the series. Thais Latham was her name, and yes, that's me, from a much earlier time. That was quite something, and this was the Electric Ear series. This was the July schedule of that series. You can see here's where Sal was there with Michael Holloway performing the piece. And the New York Times review, Electric Ear offers anti-war mixed media assault, as it was referred to by Theodore Strong in the New York Times. In the summer of 1969, I came out here from New York for a contemporary music workshop that was supported in part by the Rockefeller Foundation. And this was a pivotal moment. This is a photo from a concert of my own that was at the Electric Circus. But it's there because I wanted to point out a couple of important pieces of hardware that were part of that became very important in the birth of the Salmar. This device here was called the Heathkit Analog Digital Designer by Malmstad and Enke, which was a modular device that you could plug in cards that had logic circuits on it, and you could connect them together with wires and create sort of logic networks, logic circuit networks. They also made an analog computer, which I built from a kit I was very interested in using analog computers, which abstracted the idea of synthesizers. Analog synthesizer is basically an analog computer optimized for musicians, but I wanted it to be not optimized for musicians, to maintain its sort of abstract form, and I was using it. But there are two things important here. One is that this device became important in Sal's learning about digital circuitry, because he took a class that was offered here by Malmstad, in which the device was used. And I happened to have a friend, a colleague with whom I eventually started an electronic arts company in New York that lasted a little while, not very long because I'm a terrible businessman. But he had one of these, and so he loaned it to me, and I was using it. The other thing was I had developed a circuit that was I called it a chaotic voltage controlled frequency divider. Basically, you would feed it a sine wave, and it would produce an undertone series, which was voltage controllable. So you could make it go up and down and upside down harmonic series. But in between the harmonics, it had chaotic behavior in the way it would flip between the harmonics, and that was fascinated me. Now here's why. There's just another picture of the same concert showing again the backside of that analog digital designer. So this was my I called it something else, but this was my chaotic divider. Now in that summer of '69, I came over, and in the house, in the garage, we built a duplicate copy of this so that Sal and I could play duets with it. And we figured out a way to connect the digital designer to give it kind of sequential information, voltages, that would drive this chaotic circuit. So we had two identical systems, and then we did a concert, which is now known as the famous moon landing concert. Here's the first page of a program in which we did a concert in Gregg Hall on July 20th, 1969, at the same time as the first US person was landing on the moon. And we had television sets around the hall, and we had a whole lot of performances lined up that we conceptually thought it would have something to do with the moon. And we did various things like, we did this Haydn piece with Ed London conducting, but everybody is playing an instrument that is not their major instrument. So Sal played violin, and I played flute or something. And so it was like the kind of Portsmouth Symphonia in England, where people play scores almost as like they're classical music, almost like they're graphic scores. And so we did that. A lot of the very funny things, we did a nice version of Pierrot Lunaire. And down here, Sal and I played a duet. He suggested we call it BCAD, which I've still been trying to figure out exactly why for a long time. And it was a duet. This is that same device with that instrument. And here's what it sounded like. Let me turn it up just a little bit. Buzzy, noisy things that we were experimenting with at the time. These are the other pages of the program, just because I thought I wanted to acknowledge the other people who were part of this moon landing concert. And there were all sorts of funny things that happened. Also, in the Bill Wegman, who was a visual artist, did things like he put plastic bags underneath people's seats, and they would open them up and there would be a card, and it would tell you to do something at a particular time. Okay, at 9:32, stand up and do this. And some of them were pretty bizarre. He also had strung threads through the hall like a little spider's nest, and if you walked in as an audience, you'd get sort of tangled up in them. It was so it was quite an event, and we'll never forget that particular concert. Then, here we go. Now we're in 1970-71 season of something called Intermedia at Automation House. Automation House was run by Theodore Keel, who was Mayor John Lindsay's labor mediator. And it was turned into an exhibition space. And pretty much the same production team that did the Electric Ear series put this on. I worked with Thais Latham on that. And here's the lineup of the people who came. And here we have Sal, January 27th, 1971. And what was presented there was, at that time called the Marville construction, which was the first, well, one of the early versions of what eventually became the Salmar construction. James DeVilbiss was the collaborator with Sal in building that. That's when he called it the Marville construction. There were 2 or 3 different iterations that finally led to what the Salmar that we see today became. And it was an incredible series of collaborations with people from the engineering, and here's another picture of it. You can see up there, this is one of the polyplanar speakers in a plastic housing, and those were hung all over the space wherever you might see it. Now this is a drawing Sal made for the conception of the Salmar as we see it today, and there are several interesting things about it. First of all, he was conceiving of it as a set of orchestras, in fact 4 electronic orchestras. And it's interesting that in a way there was a kind of what Anthony Braxton calls multi-orchestralism going on in contemporary music at that time. There was Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Gruppen and then his for 4 orchestras, and then there was Carré, which was several orchestras and choruses, and there was Braxton himself made a piece for 4 orchestras. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know. You know, Xenakis was doing pieces dividing up the orchestra into many parts that were, and on the other side of the world, Sun Ra was making multiple ensembles playing together. So it was kind of interesting. He thought that way, but he had the idea. You can see here that there would be a control unit, and there would be an orchestra and a soloist, which is interesting. And then these get somehow mixed and distributed, and then already the output of 24 speakers. So that was a conceptual idea that was, and eventually, what it turned into were really 4 independent sets of circuitry that he called orchestras, and they're controlled by one control panel. So that one control panel is controlling everything, but it's multiplexed, meaning that you have to switch from orchestra to orchestra to orchestra. So the signals the controls that come from pressing those touch buttons would go to whichever orchestra you were selecting. So you had to select which one, and then you go to the next one and the next one, and you keep changing them as you want to. Now, bear in mind that the instrument is not what you might think of as a one-to-one action sound instrument. It's not like a piano. You push a key and you get this result from that key. You're setting up things. You're setting up compositional structures. You're setting up combinations and permutations and pseudo-random sequences and so on, which eventually you hear the effect of it. So it's not like you go beep, 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 beep. You go, and then something happens, right? So it's that kind of thing. So you're constantly inputting data that then gets, the effect of which might take a little while to appear. I remember one day when there was some kind of joke, somebody challenged Sal to see if he could play Happy Birthday on the Salmar. And he actually tried and got kind of close. But it's not that kind of an instrument. Then another key part of this is what was called information steering, and these programmable sequence generators were pseudo-random sequence material. And there was this concept. The operator would be setting up the kinds of sequences that would take place, and on a macro structure level, meaning the kind of thing I was just talking about putting in compositional structures and information. And then there was this thing he called information steering, in which the results of that would be sent to various parts of the sound generating system. And it was actually hybrid. There were analog circuit cards in it, that dealt with certain types of filtering processes and various other things that lead to the output of the system. And then there was a programmable sequence generation, again pseudo-random, on the microstructural level, which would control the sound modules. That meaning the waveforms, the actual waveforms that you would output. So here we are. There's a close-up of the labeled panel. Again, same thing that you've just seen, but you get a little bit more of a close-up. So another thing was that it had a hierarchy of clocks, of time controllers, that were where one would control another, control another, control another, and there was feedback from the bottom ones, but not from the top one. So this sort of hierarchy of interacting clocks, triggering things off in different time frames. This is a close-up of the patch panel. Now the patch panel was absolutely critical, and it was, once it was set up and refined, boy, you didn't want that thing to fall apart. So, so it would take forever to put it back together to get what you were doing. So it did fold down. There's a hinge along here, and it would fold down on top of the panel, and that was the way it would get transported. Now, I remember most of the time when I was present at various Salmar performances. I brought Sal up to Toronto, was at York University, and out to Mills College later. He would usually show up, if possible, with an engineer helper coming along. And before you knew it, out came the oscilloscope and the tested gear to find out, oh, why wasn't this working quite right? And cards would be coming out, and they would be working on it, and they would get it back. They would get it to work right, and then you'd have a performance. But it was generally part of the process, if possible. So in December of 1977, I was visiting over at the house, and we spent some time in the studio, and we played a long duet session. And I had brought along what I was working with at the time. I had some Buchla modular equipment, and I had built some digital control interface stuff that I developed myself for it. At one point I was using a small mini computer made by a company called Interdata, and I developed an interface between that and my Buchla stuff. So I collaborated with Don Buchla quite a bit in various system designs. And we played a duet. And this is not from that event. This is actually from a festival in Florida, where we found ourselves in Tampa at one point. And that's myself at that time, Sal, that's the great late artist Mary Ashley, who was also part of that festival. And I wanted you to hear a little bit of this. So this is a duet between the Salmar and my system. And there is a part of it which is available on a CD now, an anthology CD. It gets wilder and wilder if you listen to the track. I had a cassette of that I took home with me after that session, and I have to thank John again, because John found the quarter-inch 4-track tape from that session and sent it to me. And it's a funny story, actually. It arrived as a pancake, not with real flanges, and it had fallen apart. And so my partner at the time and I actually, little by little, unraveled and untangled the tape until we finally got it back on a reel, and then I was able to mix it and release it. It was quite a process. So I came in '95 back here for another residency, and did some things, and we had a wonderful time doing a concert together, and then I was in actually this room giving a Composers Forum event. And we did a concert in which I did a couple of pieces, and LGA was played over across the street in Cranit, and it was quite a wonderful experience. Here's just another picture. That's me on the left, and Sal, and the great pianist J.B. Floyd, who I've worked with and was a great admirer of Sal, and Dorothy on the right. Now I wanted to also give a little bit of, point a little bit of attention on what happened after the Salmar. And here are some of the highlights. Sal did go on and make additional systems, using what he called SAL, which stood for Sound and Logic, which was originally using LULISP. Well, Lisp is a language used largely in artificial intelligence, and LULISP was a version of that, and then made something called Yaha Salma Mac, in which he was using MIDI instruments at this time. And he did pieces involving keyboard, Dorothy playing electric violin, and various things with that, from that. Then there was another one called Sat Behind demo, which was using the Kima system. I don't know if Carla's here or not, Carla Scaletti, but he did have a version of that system, and then he had to use, to do that, he had to convert the Sound and Logic program into an early object-oriented language called Smalltalk 80, and used the Yamaha DX7 keyboard as an input to that, and then driving the Kima system, which was particularly good at working with samples, sound samples, and he did a piece, I know, with various voice samples and so on. Object-oriented programming was really emerging at that time. There were some other examples. Besides Smalltalk 80, there was something called HMSL, which stands for Hierarchical Music Specification Language, that my colleague Phil Burke and Larry Polanski and I developed while I was at Mills College in the 80s, and another one called Formula by Anderson and Ron Quivela at Wesleyan, both constructed using a language called Forth, which was a very effective one and very widely used by experimental composers at the time because it was accessible and it ran very well on small computers that were affordable and allowed you to build, it's a stack-oriented language that allowed you to build things very efficiently. And then there was something called the Yaha Salma Mac, well, no, that's the same thing here, where we went back to using LULISP. Actually, I'm repeating myself on this slide. And there was a piece called 4 Not 2. Here's what it sounded like. And that was, of course, Dorothy playing electric violin on that. Then came some other pieces for ensembles. This one, UIUS and Just for Laughs, is interesting in a number of ways. It's an instrumental piece, so there's flute and clarinet and double bass lines above in the score. And then there is the Selma Mac orchestra, which is actually fully notated, interestingly. And you can see these runs of sort of parallel chord things that were coming out of that. And so it's interesting to see how this suddenly goes to a kind of orchestration of the electronics. Now, I don't know exactly, obviously it was composed, it was fixed media when it was played, but here it appears in a score as the electronic part, which is interesting, in '91. And then finally, it's just some of, just a nod to some of the last later instrumental pieces. One really terrific piece called Londons, dedicated to Ed London and Howie Smith, saxophone player for the Cleveland Chamber Symphony. And you can see on this page, here we have Sound and Logic, because I think Sal used the Sound and Logic program to develop compositional data that appeared in scores for instrumentalists or for orchestras. And I know of three that particularly, these two pictures here, it's interesting that Sound and Logic, the words actually appear in the score as part of a movement of the piece. There's a great piece that's called Throne. There's a manuscript of it at the in the CalArts archives I found, but I actually don't have a picture of it. But the incredible group called Tone Road Ramblers, which originated here, was written for them, I think. And those players are absolutely amazing. So Jim Staley there, by the way, went on to New York to open the Roulette, what's now called Roulette, which is an amazing performance space in New York that has been a major place. And then the last major work called Isabella for orchestra. I've had the privilege of conducting both of these pieces in LA. And this one is really, really rich. It's full of very complex stuff, and he was writing it during a residency when Dorothy and Sal were both out at CalArts for a while. And this was the result. It's really quite an amazing piece. Here's a little bit of the sound of it. You can turn it up a little. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. Now we're going to do two things. Of course, we were very sad to hear of the recent passing of Michael Holloway, who was a very, very close friend of Sal's and collaborator, and was this incredible performer in the piece LGA. Unfortunately, we had hoped that Michael would actually come and read a poem, but it didn't happen. So John has provided a couple of recordings, and I'm going to play two. One is an excerpt from a eulogy that he did for Sal at Sal's memorial, I believe, in 1995 in Smith Hall, I think. And I was there and heard it, and here is an excerpt.
This morning I'm going to talk about one who was a collaborator, a conspirator, and an inspiration to me and with me. Sal was an early and constant supporter of me as a writer. Today I'm going to talk openly and publicly about one who has had an enormous impact on my life. It is altogether fitting and proper that I should do this. I had heard Sal's music and had been astounded and moved by it when John English, the great trombone player, introduced me to Sal. I took him some of my poems. He read them. He said they were good. I was elated. Sal then asked me if I could write a speech. I said I hadn't in some years, and that I could. Sal explained that he needed to give a talk about his music at Mills College in Oakland, California. He offered to pay me $10. An enormous amount of money in 1966. We proceeded to spend between 3 and 18 hours a day for the next 10 days, listening to tapes, studying scores, writing a speech about his compositions and their historical context. Part of that speech constitutes the notes for Underworld on the new Centaur CD, by the way. During this period of work, we were not always entirely sane. Sal supplied me with food and drink. He came to have some regard for the Irish dryness at the back of the throat. We ate pasta at 3 a.m. and 7-egg omelets at 7:30 a.m. In this time, I learned, starting from near zero, more about Sal's music and 20th century music than the normally acceptable garden variety PhD musicology student. The experience was astonishing, enlightening, and strangely coherent. Sal gave particular attention to explaining and analyzing the notation, structure, and form of oh, 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 that Shakespearean rag and underworld. This was for Sal and me the beginning of a long, intense, tender relationship. Sal was a creative force. I cannot overestimate the use of this phrase, creative force. He not only did his own thing, he also got many of us going and frequently kept us going.
And then the poem that we were expecting Michael to read, John found a recording of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is represented as Sal's favorite poem of Michael's.
This poem is entitled Temperate Zone Hurricane. It's not the shit, it's the fan. World is full of shit. Can't get away from the shit. Get away from the fan. Don't trip. 600 miles per hour, or 965.6,082,527 10 million kilometer per hour shit is a real problem. It will hurt you, and it will hurt you good. Don't trip now. Get away from the fan. Also, flying sweets, chocolate, biscotti, green beans, dal, and other airborne lovelies can kill your ass when encountered at sufficient velocity. Velocity, because speed and direction are important, as in traveling fast and striking not you, can be sort of funny when the speeding turd hits someone else's red-faced head, or kind of cute as the lips shape that elegant fish-mouthed zero toward the end of ow. A friend, under duress, once pointed out to me that in the case of a crock of shit, the crock simply serves to keep the shit outside the crock from getting on the shit inside the crock. Don't trip, block, or transport. Are you pro-crock or pro-fan? Pro-fade or pro-croak? A crock fan or fan crock? Crock pot, top cork, crack pot? Yeah. Don't be shit sure and fan foolish. Don't trip. Don't trip now.
So finally, I'd like to invite my friend and someone who worked with Sal, Ben Grosser, come down here, and we're going to have an improvisatory panel discussion about Sal in the context and his work in the context of music today and its influence and whatever stories we might come up with. Here's Ben.
Well, it's hard to have that poem not be the end of the event in some ways, because we pulled that poem out in particular when we heard that Michael had passed and did some readings of it. Yeah. Okay. How about now? Anyway, it's a great poem.
Yeah, it's true. The importance of Sal's influence is I think growing maybe, but not yet to the level of the impact that he had on a lot of us. There are quite a few people out in the world doing particularly wonderful things in music that had significant encounters with Sal and learned from him, or were students of his like we were. And so it's great that we're doing what we can to make that more well known. It'd be nice if there were more performances of a lot of the pieces around. And so we would like to sort of support that and encourage it. The compositional ideas were really very important. One particularly that I will always remember. And by the way, I would go to his office and meet at whatever the lesson time was, and we would have something of a lesson, and then usually we would walk down the street to Trino's, and what was called Trino's at that time, and we would sit there and talk for the rest of the afternoon, or, you know, the rest of the day, about all kinds of really great stuff. I remember one thing in particular I didn't mention was that there's one particular talk that had a super impact on me, and it led to what I now call, what I refer to as a kind of compositional method called choose your universe. And it was about saying, okay, you're going to do something new, strip away everything you know, and go back to a place where you start by saying, what are the things to which you're going to address compositional attention? That's an open question, whatever that might be, right? Is it notes? Is it the size and shape of instruments on stage? Is it sound in space? Is it crazy words and actions and film? Is it running around and jumping up and down? Whatever it might be. So you start by that, and then from there you build your system, right? You build your way of dealing with what psychologists call the just noticeable difference. But what Sal used, that he referred to, how do you tell that this is different than this, or they're the same? So you'd start with that kind of thinking in composition, and so we would talk about stuff like that for hours and hours, right? You probably did too.
Yeah, I certainly have my own recollections of even some of the things you mentioned, such as the 3 o'clock pasta and the 7:30 a.m. breakfast. And usually Sal was still up when we left. And in some ways I feel like see, now it's too close. I had the good fortune of arriving and getting to hang out in Sal's studio at Sal and Dorothy's house at the time when the Salmar was the thing in the corner that, you know, looked crazy and wild, and I knew what it was, but it wasn't really what Sal was focused on at the time. It was more the what you called the post-Salmar works. UIUS Just for Laughs, the Yaha Salmamac Orchestra, the work with Dorothy and the electric violin, and the Kima coming along, and one of the things I feel like I really got from Sal in that moment was the comfort that he held and had with leaving the last thing behind to take on the next thing, even though we really wanted him. So we could get him to play tapes of the Salmar and put them on, but it wasn't like it was something he had fired up.
Yeah, right. I remember one day we were in there, and he had some tapes of Luigi Dalla Piccola, who he studied with in Italy, talking, and with this a really evocative kind of voice, and he was like fascinated by just the nature of the voice of Dalla Piccola talking. One day we were playing again and again and listening to stuff and getting kind of inspired by that. So between that and his fascination with Rossini, who is the word Rossini appears in the score of Isabella, actually. Why? It just shows up, on the top of the staff at a certain point.
Yeah, but lots of opera, for sure. Thinking a little bit about the kind of the topic at hand, and going back to some of the compositional things, and ways in which I mean, there are plenty of people in this room who have better sense of the current state of music and where Sal's influence is or isn't recognized. But I see all these parallels from my vantage point now as someone in art, where Sal was focused on the creation of a compositional machine on the if I think about when the Salmar was being made in 69, 70, and in that moment, and the way in which you talked about it as the embodiment of the way that he thought being embedded into a machine, which I feel like he then took on figuring out how to compose for, how to perform with, in the same way that he had learned how to compose for and perform with other humans before that.
Right.
In several of the pieces that you showed. And turns out to be the same moment that's kind of the birth of generative art and computer art. 1968, 1969, Vera Molnar is a good example. And here we are in 2022, and there's kind of been this resurgence of interest in AI-produced art for a variety of reasons. And it's almost in some ways like a lot of these histories have been forgotten in both music and art. But I can easily see the influence of that way of thinking continuing to kind of reverberate over and over throughout multiple fields at this point.
Right, absolutely. The growth of the interest in generative processes now it's everywhere. We're all working with it, and what this really brings up is one of the things it brings up is the idea of what is an instrument. What is an instrument? It's completely blown up these days in terms of what that means. What an instrument that doesn't necessarily, like a piano, produce a B flat when you press a B flat key. It might produce something that you can't predict, or it might redesign itself, right? So you have a different sort of interactive relationship with the medium that you're working with, and how you create it as its sort of interface. So this was definitely part of that the growth of that way of thinking. It really turns performance on its head in a way.
Yeah, in the same way, I think that say jazz improvisation is is an experience of, which that was probably my first experience of Sal, was just playing at Nature's Table before I even was a student. But the way in which you make an offer, perhaps, and then it's somehow that plays for the brain of the other person you're with, and it transforms into some kind of a response, and that act, that exchange.
Right.
That way of thinking about one's interaction with a computer at this point, or digital system then, is still certainly active and it's been active throughout that entire period.
Yeah. Right, absolutely. And interactivity in a quite a broad way of thinking about it. I sort of jokingly say we're in a post-genre world. There's no such thing as genre in a way, because we all can go anywhere we want, and everything has its own legitimate way of being. But you think about the influence of jazz, the influence of all kinds of noise and ways of making music. In a way, it seemed to me like that. Sal was a little bit like that. I mean, he would take from inspiration from a wide range of music making, not a particularly clearly identified lineage necessarily. It could jump all over the place, right? And then working with people, people like Don Smith or all these people, the engineers and musicians, making pieces that really are for those people. It was a part of the process. That's something that impressed me as well. I've kind of done that myself, working with individuals collaboratively.
No question. I mean, I even think, I mean, you mentioned engineers watching or, learning, hearing him tell stories about, but also learning some since then of the ways in which he navigated the university in order to acquire materials, in order to take advantage of technology that was across campus that wasn't really meant to do the things that he was doing with them, finding ways to make possible dedication of those resources to what he wanted to do is certainly something I took inspiration from in my time at the university as well, in terms of how to navigate. I mean, he told me this, I don't remember the exact specifics anymore, but the part of the Salmar, you might know this story better than I do, but there was a fire in one of the, I don't know, the Iliac computers or one of the IBM computers. And this is back when these computers took up a whole room and they were not particularly safe objects, I guess. And he was able to cannibalize a ton of whatever wasn't quite too burned to integrate it into the Salmar. But even in, I mean, I went on to build my own painting robot many, many years later that also now sits in the corner of my studio and does nothing. And that way of like taking the way you think and then trying to build it into a machine, but then having the joy of realizing the machine doesn't do things that you don't know why it does what it does. You just have to kind of learn what it is. Right. That approach is one that I feel like I've seen in works of others and works of myself. I had the fortune of also working, I've studied with several people who were probably in the room back in my time here, but one of them was Zach Browning, who also studied with Sal. Right. And so I kind of got Sal's ways of thinking from Sal, but also from Zach. And of course, Sal's ways of thinking reverberated throughout the department at the time.
Right. Yeah. I'm wondering, should we see if there's anybody who would like to ask a question?
Of course.
Or
comment.
Or comment before we close it up? Yes, someone up there. I can't see who you are, but.
Can you talk a little bit about the element of surprise in terms of that point where you know what the machine will do and you don't know? And you referred to the element of surprise earlier. I think what Ben just said kind of is a reference to that interaction, that the machine becomes sort of an individual with its own contributions that surprise you.
Yeah, well, the element of surprise can be, you can work with the element of surprise kind of in the way you would in some dramatic form, or sort of, you can think of it in a theatrical context, you can think of it pretty intuitively, but especially with the systems that we've been working with and other things, you can actually quantify it in a certain way, because you can, I'll talk about this in another event, but working with actually measuring evoked responses of the brain that respond to differences that are contextual. So surprise has to do with what comes before, right? So if you've got something that is highly jumping around and all sorts of things, and then suddenly it stabilizes itself, that's one kind of surprise. Or if you're listening to a drone and then it moves just a little bit, that's a surprise. So the degree to which surprise is really surprise has to do with the process of prediction as well, based on what came before, and then finding that prediction is disconfirmed, right? And so you can do, I have a piece called Predictions, Confirmations, and Disconfirmations, which is all about that. And now I can sort of trace that back to some of the conversations I had with Sal when I was working with him as a student. And we were thinking about, okay, well, it's surprise. How surprising? How different? How, and how do we measure these kinds of differences and what their effect is on listening, assuming you're paying attention, right? So I guess, does that help contextualize it a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, I would add that I think they're just thinking about Sal. One of the things that, getting to watch him compose in those last several years, one thing I'm sure was your experience, certainly in your descriptions, but also in my own, was just how open and inclusive Sal was about, here's what I'm doing, here's how I'm doing it, here's how I'm thinking, and just the way in which, he would think about in some of these notated works, like UAS Just for Laughs, about composed surprise, how to compose surprise. And often the technique he would describe to me was some version of, I write the thing out and then I take this part and I put it over here because it's not supposed to be there, and like really deconstructing something he had built. In my own experience with building my own machine, the element of surprise, I think, like the one I'm thinking about is the robot that I built had a sound analysis component. So it was listening to its environment and using that as input for the painting process. And I wrote when I programmed that analytical component, it was intentionally disconnected from the musical qualities of whatever it would be hearing. It was really like, well, if I were to do a rhythmic analysis in code, what would it look like? If I were to do a pitch analysis in code, how would I structure it? How would I make decisions? Just trying to be as disconnected as possible. And then it turns out that the machine makes the best music in response to Miles Davis and the worst music in response to, just whatever crap I didn't like.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is.
Yeah.
I can deconstruct it now, but it's like,
Yeah.
so the both impossibility of actually having surprise, but also the way in which surprise can be composed intentionally and
Right.
unintentionally.
Right, yeah, and there was always, no matter how abstract the system was, there was always a kind of, I don't know how to describe it, other than some sort of innate musicality in the shapes of gestures, the shapes of things, no matter what the generative system was. With Sal's work was always there. It was always present. So that's something that it's very elusive to figure out what puts it there. It's not an algorithm, but it's something. Anything else?
I think you were going to comment earlier about one of the rules, compositional rules that Sal included.
Choose your universe.
I thought what you were going to say, maybe not, was that you can break any rule at any time, basically.
You can break any rule at any time, but
And he did.
Right. But you can also make your own rules and then break those. Right. So it's like rules are made to be broken in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. You should be on the stage with us here. So many of us could be on the stage.
There was something you said earlier. You were talking about Dalla Piccola and how he was listening to the sound of his voice. I remember he spent endless hours watching the O.J. Simpson trials because he was sick, partly. And I was ragging on him, saying, "God, how do you watch that garbage for so many hours a day?" And he said, "Oh, but I'm not listening to what they're saying. I'm listening to the way they say it."
Yeah. Yeah, right. That makes perfect sense. Well, shall we call it a night? Okay, thank you.